The unexpected fall. Clara Mendez believed she had built a quiet, respectable life. Not perfect, but stable. She had a small apartment, a steady routine, and a husband who, at least on the surface, seemed reliable. For 7 years, she told herself that love didn't need fireworks, that calm was enough. That illusion began to crack on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Clara stood in the kitchen, preparing coffee before leaving for her private tutoring sessions. Renato sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging her presence. She mentioned casually that one of her students had finally improved in math. "That's good," he replied without looking up. "Just don't expect that to change anything." She froze for a second, then forced a smile. Renato always spoke like that lately, sharp, dismissive, as if her words were interruptions rather than part of a shared life. Still, she convinced herself it was stress, work pressure, temporary distance. As she left the apartment, her phone buzzed. A call from the hospital. Her heart tightened before she even answered. "Mrs. Mendez, your mother has been admitted to the emergency room. She suffered a stroke. We need you here as soon as possible." The world tilted. Clara barely remembered the drive. Traffic lights blurred, sounds dulled, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Her mother was all she had left. The woman who raised her alone, who worked double shifts so Clara could study, who never once complained. At the hospital, the smell of antiseptic filled her lungs as a doctor explained the situation. Critical but stable, intensive care required, immediate decisions to be made. And then came the question Clara wasn't prepared for. "Do you have private insurance?" She shook her head. The estimated cost echoed in her mind like a sentence being handed down. Clara stepped into the hallway, her legs weak, and called Renato. Once, twice, 3 times. When he finally answered, his voice was impatient.
"What is it now, Clara? I'm busy." Her voice broke as she spoke. "My mother, she had a stroke. I need you." There was a pause, not of concern, of calculation. And in that silence, Clara felt something inside her begin to collapse, quietly, irrevocably, without yet knowing that this was only the beginning of her fall. The hospital corridor was quiet when Clara returned home that night, yet her apartment felt even colder. The silence there wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, deliberate. Renato arrived hours later, loosening his tie as if the day had exhausted only him. He didn't ask about her mother. Clara watched him move around the living room, opening the fridge, glancing at his phone, completely untouched by the fear that still clung to her chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, almost apologetic. "The doctor said the next few days are critical." Renato nodded vaguely. "I told you I had meetings. There was nothing I could do." Something inside her tightened.
She wanted to scream, to ask how a husband could sound so detached while his wife's world was falling apart. Instead, she swallowed her words. She always did. Over time, their marriage had turned into a quiet arrangement rather than a partnership. Renato paid the bills, at least the ones he considered necessary, and Clara managed the rest. Groceries, her mother's medication, her own expenses. Anytime she mentioned money, his expression hardened. "You chose a modest career," he often said. "I'm not responsible for fixing that." At night, they slept side by side without touching. Conversations were reduced to logistics. No warmth, no curiosity, no shared dreams. Clara told herself that this was what adulthood looked like: compromise, patience, endurance. But lying awake in the dark, listening to Renato's steady breathing, she felt profoundly alone. The next morning, she mentioned the hospital expenses again. The words barely left her mouth before his tone sharpened.
"I'm not paying for private care," he said flatly. "Your mother isn't my responsibility." The finality of his voice cut deeper than any shout could have. Clara nodded, even though her chest burned. She learned in that moment how small she had become inside her own marriage. How carefully she had learned to ask for less, to expect less. As Renato left for work, the door closing with a dull thud, Clara remained standing in the middle of the room, realizing that the distance between them was no longer emotional. It was absolute. And somewhere beneath that realization, a quiet question formed, one she was afraid to answer. How long had she been living like this, without noticing? Clara returned to the hospital early the next morning, carrying a bag she had packed without thinking. Inside were clothes she might not need, a book she wouldn't read, and a quiet hope she was afraid to name. The rhythmic beeping of machines greeted her as she stepped into the intensive care unit.
Her mother lay still, her face pale, fragile in a way Clara had never seen before. The doctor explained the situation again, possible complications, constant monitoring, expensive treatments that could not wait. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on Clara's chest. She nodded, asked questions, tried to sound composed, but her hands trembled as she signed forms she barely understood. By noon, the hospital administrator requested a decision. "We need a guarantee of payment," the woman said gently, as if kindness could soften the blow. "Otherwise, we'll have to transfer her." Clara stepped into the hallway, her vision blurring. She called Renato once more, hoping, despite everything, that this time would be different. He answered quickly, irritation clear in his voice. "I already told you, Clara, I can't help you." "She's my mother," Clara whispered. "Please, I'll pay you back." There was a pause, followed by a sigh that sounded more like annoyance than thought.
You should have planned better. I'm not responsible for your family's problems. The call ended. Clara stared at her phone, her reflection faint on the dark screen. In that moment, something inside her finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The man she had married was no longer standing beside her. He had stepped away without looking back. She returned to her mother's bedside, holding her hand, fighting tears. She promised her she would find a way. She didn't know how, but she would. As evening approached, Clara left the hospital to clear her head. The city lights blurred through her tears as she walked without direction, her mind replaying Renato's words over and over. She needed answers, not about the money, but about her marriage. And without fully understanding why, her feet carried her toward Renato's office building, driven by a quiet, desperate instinct that would soon change everything she thought she knew.
Clara arrived at Renato's office just after sunset. The building was nearly empty, its glass walls reflecting the city lights like cold mirrors. She hesitated at the entrance, unsure of what she expected to find, an explanation, perhaps, or a version of her husband who would finally look at her with concern. She took the elevator to his floor, her heart pounding with each ascending second. The corridor was quiet, too quiet. As she approached Renato's office, she heard laughter, soft, intimate, unmistakably close. Clara slowed her steps, her breath catching in her throat. The door was slightly open. Through the narrow gap, she saw him. Renato stood near his desk, his jacket discarded, his expression relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in months. In front of him was a woman Clara recognized instantly, his boss. Elegant, confident. One hand rested on his chest, the other brushing his cheek as she leaned in. Then they kissed. Not a stolen, guilty kiss, a familiar one. Clara felt the floor drop beneath her. She pushed the door open before fear could stop her. The sound startled them both. Renato turned, his face draining of color, while the woman merely raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a calm, almost amused smile. "So?" the woman said coolly, straightening her blouse. "You must be the wife." Clara's voice trembled. "How long?" Renato opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence answered for him. "You look tired," the woman continued, her tone sharp and dismissive.
I suppose that's what happens when you cling to a life you can't afford. Clara looked at Renato, waiting, begging for him to deny it, to defend her. He didn't. I didn't plan for you to find out like this, he muttered, but maybe it's for the best. For the best? Clara repeated, disbelief flooding her chest. You and I, we outgrew each other, he said flatly. She understands me, my ambitions. The words struck harder than the betrayal itself.
Clara felt exposed, humiliated, stripped of every illusion she had protected. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her steps unsteady but determined. As the elevator doors closed, tears streamed down her face, not just for the marriage she lost, but for the woman she had been inside it. And as she stepped into the night, Clara didn't yet know that this moment, this brutal truth, was the end of one life and the painful beginning of another. Clara didn't remember how she got home. She only remembered sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat, staring at the wall as the night slowly dissolved into early morning. The apartment felt chush, foreign, like a place she no longer belonged. By sunrise, her phone buzzed with a message from Renato. I'll send someone to collect my things. No apology, no explanation. Clara exhaled shakily and let the phone slip from her hand. The finality of it pressed down on her chest, leaving little room to breathe.
She packed a small bag and left the apartment before anyone arrived. Pride was the only thing she had left, and she clung to it fiercely. She moved into a tiny spare room offered by a former colleague. The walls were bare, the mattress thin, and the future unbearably uncertain. Each night, Clara lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds, her thoughts spiraling between her mother's condition and the echo of Renato's words. At the hospital, her mother remained unconscious. Clara held her hand and whispered reassurances she wasn't sure she believed herself. She smiled for the nurses, nodded at the doctors, and cried only when she was alone. The bills began to pile up, numbers she couldn't possibly meet. Fear settled deep inside her, heavy and constant. More than once, Clara wondered if she had failed at life itself, at choosing love, at building security, at protecting the one person who had always protected her. One evening, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed,
Clara covered her face with her hands and finally allowed herself to cry without restraint. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space in a world that had already pushed her aside. And yet, beneath the exhaustion and despair, a fragile determination began to take shape. She had lost everything, which meant she had nothing left to lose. Clara spent the next few days moving through life on autopilot. Between hospital visits and sleepless nights, she searched for work wherever she could. Online listings, tutoring forums, old contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. Pride had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Most responses were polite refusals. Some never replied at all. Then, late one night, she noticed an advertisement that stood out. Private educator needed. Discretion required. Excellent compensation. There were no details, no company name, no explanation beyond a short list of expectations and a phone number.
the pay was far above anything she had ever earned. Clara stared at the screen for a long moment, suspicion tightening her chest. It sounded too good to be true. Still, desperation outweighed caution. She dialed the number before she could change her mind. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. A woman explained that the position involved tutoring a child in a private residence. Strict boundaries, clear rules, immediate start. "Can you come for an interview tomorrow?" the woman asked. Clara hesitated, thinking of the hospital bills, her mother's fragile body connected to machines, the empty space where her marriage had once been. "Yes," she said quietly, "I can." The address arrived by message minutes later. The location alone made her heart skip, a gated neighborhood she had only ever passed by on the bus. That night, Clara barely slept. Questions raced through her mind. Who lived there? Why such secrecy? What kind of family needed this level of discretion?
By morning, fear mixed with resolve.
She dressed simply, choosing clothes that made her feel invisible, safe. As she stepped out into the street, Clara took a deep breath. This wasn't an opportunity born of ambition or hope. It was survival. And without realizing it, she was already walking toward the place where everything would begin to change. The taxi slowed as it approached the iron gates, tall and imposing, framed by manicured hedges that seemed to stretch endlessly on either side. Clara gave the address to the driver again, half expecting him to tell her there had been a mistake. There wasn't. A security guard checked her name against a list before the gates opened with silent precision. The car rolled forward, following a curved driveway that led to a mansion unlike anything Clara had ever seen outside of magazines. White stone, wide windows, and a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. As she stepped out, the air itself felt different, quieter, heavier. Inside, a woman in a tailored suit greeted her with polite efficiency. No smiles, no small talk. Clara was guided through long corridors, past minimalist artwork and furniture that looked untouched, as if the house existed more as a display than a home. "This residence values discretion," the woman said. "Personal matters are not discussed." Clara nodded, feeling suddenly very small. They stopped in a bright room overlooking the garden. A child sat at a desk, drawing in silence. She looked up briefly, large eyes, cautious and distant, before returning to her paper. "That's Sophia," the woman said softly. "She's 9. Clara felt an unexpected tightening in her chest. Before she could speak, footsteps echoed behind them. A man entered the room, his presence immediately commanding the space. Tall, impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable. "This is Mr. Eduardo Vasconcelos," the woman announced. Eduardo's gaze settled on Clara, assessing but not unkind.
There was something cold in his eyes, controlled, deliberate, but also something wounded beneath the surface. "You have experience with children?" he asked. "Yes," Clara replied, steadying her voice, "and with grief." The words seemed to hang between them. For the briefest moment, Eduardo's jaw tightened. "Good," he said, "because this house doesn't need noise, it needs stability." As Clara looked around the silent, luxurious room, at the child who barely spoke, at the man who barely felt, she understood one thing with startling clarity. This world was not hers. Yet for reasons she couldn't explain, it already felt like the place where her life was about to change. Eduardo Vasconcelos didn't offer Clara a seat. He remained standing near the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the garden as if the conversation were a formality he intended to endure rather than engage in. "I don't believe in second chances," he said without turning. "This position requires discipline,
Not emotional involvement." Clara met his distance with quiet composure. "Children need structure," she replied, "but they also need to feel safe." He finally looked at her then, his gaze sharp. Safety is provided by order. She recognized the tone immediately, the voice of someone who had learned to survive by controlling everything around him. Eduardo explained the rules with precision: fixed schedules, no personal questions, no physical affection unless initiated by Sophia, absolute confidentiality. Clara listened carefully, absorbing each word, aware that this job was unlike any she had held before. "Your role is temporary," he added. "If you prove useful, it may continue." Useful. The word stung, but Clara said nothing. She needed this. Before she could respond, Sophia entered the room quietly, holding a book against her chest. She stopped when she saw Clara, her fingers tightening around the cover. "This is Clara," Eduardo said, his tone softer, but still distant.
"She'll be helping you with your studies." Sophia nodded without speaking. Clara crouched slightly, lowering herself to the child's level. "Hi, Sophia."
I like your drawing from earlier. Sophia's eyes flickered with surprise. You noticed? Clara smiled. It was hard not to. Something shifted, small, almost invisible. Eduardo watched the exchange closely, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Clara sensed a crack in his carefully built walls, not open, not welcoming, but there. As she followed the housekeeper to see the room prepared for her, Clara realized that Eduardo Vasconcelos wasn't cold by nature. He was frozen. And frozen things, she knew, could melt. Slowly, painfully, but only approached with care. Sophia rarely spoke during the first few days. She followed instructions, completed her assignments with quiet precision, and kept her emotions carefully contained, as if any display of feeling might disturb the fragile balance of the house. Clara didn't push.
Instead, she sat beside her, offering gentle guidance, praising effort rather than results. She noticed the way Sophia's shoulders relaxed when she felt understood, the way her pencil strokes softened when Clara spoke calmly beside her. One afternoon, while working on a reading exercise, Sophia paused. "Do you miss your mom?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara's chest tightened. She chose her words carefully. "Yes," she answered honestly, "every day." Sophia nodded, staring at the page. "I don't remember her voice anymore." The confession landed heavily in the room. Clara reached out slowly, stopping just short of touching the girl's hand, respecting the boundaries Eduardo had set. "That doesn't mean she's gone from you," she said gently. "Memories live in more ways than sound." Sophia looked up at her, eyes shining. For the first time, tears spilled freely. From the doorway, Eduardo watched in silence. He had seen therapists come and go,
Each following protocols that never quite reached his daughter. Yet here was this woman, quiet, patient, doing what none of them had managed. That evening, Sophia asked if Clara would stay for dinner. Eduardo hesitated before agreeing. At the table, the atmosphere was different, softer. Sophia spoke more, her sentences small but deliberate. Clara responded with warmth, careful not to intrude. Eduardo listened. He noticed how Sophia laughed when Clara mispronounced a word, how she leaned closer without realizing it. A sense of unfamiliar emotion stirred inside him. Relief, perhaps, or fear. Later that night, as Clara prepared to leave, Sophia tugged gently at her sleeve. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Clara smiled. "If you'll have me." Eduardo stood behind them, watching as his daughter's guarded world began to open, quietly, unexpectedly, bridged by a woman who had walked into their lives without force, and yet had already changed everything. Days turned into a steady rhythm. Clara arrived each morning at the same time, her presence becoming as natural as the light filtering through the tall windows of the mansion. Sophia began greeting her at the door, book in hand, her once guarded expression softening with each passing day. Their lessons extended beyond textbooks. Clara encouraged Sophia to ask questions, to tell stories, to imagine endings that didn't always end in loss. Slowly, laughter returned to the house, not loud or disruptive, but real. Eduardo observed from a distance. He said little, yet nothing escaped his attention. He noticed how Sophia slept better, how she spoke more at meals, how her eyes no longer held the same constant sadness. Change was happening, whether he approved of it or not. One evening, Eduardo found Clara in the kitchen, helping Sophia bake cookies, an activity he had never allowed before. "This wasn't on the schedule," he said sharply. Clara met his gaze calmly. "She asked," she replied. "And sometimes routine needs a little warmth." Eduardo's instinct was to object. Instead, he remained silent. Later that night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Eduardo poured himself a drink and paused by the doorway of the study where Clara was gathering her things. "You're overstepping," he said quietly. Clara turned. "I'm helping her heal." The honesty in her voice disarmed him. For the first time, Eduardo spoke of his late wife, not in detail, not in emotion, but in fragments. A shared silence followed, heavy yet strangely comfortable. As Clara left, Eduardo remained standing in the dim hallway,
aware of something shifting within him. Control had always been his armor. Yet watching his daughter smile again made him question whether walls were protection or prisons. And somewhere between small gestures and quiet changes, the distance between them had begun to narrow, unnoticed yet irreversible.
Clara was leaving the hospital one afternoon when she heard her name spoken in a voice she recognized instantly. Clara. She stopped. Renato stood a few steps away, thinner than she remembered, his confidence dulled by uncertainty. Seeing him there, in a place tied so closely to pain and fear, sent a sharp jolt through her chest. "I heard about your mother," he said, lowering his voice. "I'm sorry." Clara nodded politely, saying nothing. "I made a mistake," he continued. "Everything fell apart after you left. I shouldn't have let you go like that." She studied him carefully. The familiar words no longer carried the weight they once had. There was no anger in her, only distance. "You didn't let me go," she replied calmly. "You chose someone else." Renato stepped closer. "We can fix this. I'll help with the bills. We can start over." For a moment, Clara thought of the woman she had been, afraid, dependent, willing to accept less than she deserved.
Then she thought of Sophia's smile, of the quiet respect she felt every day in a house that was never meant to be hers. "I don't need fixing," she said softly, "and neither does my life." Renato's expression faltered. He reached out, but Clara stepped back. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she added, "but it won't be with me." She walked away, her steps steady, her heart surprisingly light. The door to her past closed without drama, without regret. That evening, as Clara arrived at the mansion, Eduardo noticed something different in her, an ease, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He didn't ask questions. But for the first time, he wondered how much of her strength had been forged in pain, and what it might mean to let someone like her remain in his carefully controlled world. Eduardo received the call late at night, long after the house had gone quiet. He stood alone in his study, the city lights glowing faintly beyond the window.
As the voice on the other end delivered news he had hoped never to hear again. The lawyer's tone was precise, almost rehearsed. "The clause is very clear, Mr. Vasconcelos. If you are not legally married within 60 days, the controlling shares of the trust will be transferred to the board until Sophia turns 21. Eduardo closed his eyes slowly. The clause had been inserted at his late wife's insistence, a safeguard, she had said, to ensure Sophia would grow up in a stable family. At the time, he had agreed without argument, convinced it would never matter. Now it threatened everything. After the call ended, Eduardo remained still for a long moment. His mind raced, not with emotion, but calculation. Lawyers, extensions, loopholes, non-existent. The clause was airtight. The next morning, he asked Clara to stay after Sophia's lesson. She sensed the shift immediately. Eduardo's posture was rigid, his expression guarded.
As if he were preparing for a negotiation rather than a conversation. "There's something you need to know," he began. He explained the trust, the deadline, the consequences. Clara listened in silence, her confusion deepening with every word. "I need to get married," Eduardo said finally. "Not for love, for Sophia." Clara's breath caught. "Why are you telling me this?" Eduardo hesitated, just long enough for his carefully controlled composure to fracture. "Because I trust you," he said quietly, "and because Sophia trusts you." The words landed heavily between them. "I'm not asking for feelings," he continued. "Only an agreement, a legal arrangement. You would be protected, financially, socially. After the term ends, you'd be free to leave." Clara stared at him, stunned. "A marriage of convenience," she whispered. "Yes." Silence filled the room. Clara thought of everything she had lost, her marriage, her security, her faith and promises. She also thought of Sophia.
Of the fragile peace that had begun to grow in his house. Eduardo met her gaze, his voice low but steady. "I wouldn't ask if there were another way." And in that moment, Clara realized that the proposal before her wasn't just unexpected. It was dangerous, because accepting it could change everything she had just begun to rebuild. Clara left the mansion that evening with her thoughts in turmoil. The city felt louder than usual, every sound pressing in on her as she replayed Eduardo's words again and again. A marriage without love, an agreement built on necessity. It was the kind of proposal she once would have accepted without hesitation, back when survival meant silence. Now she wasn't so sure. At the hospital, she sat beside her mother's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. The machines hummed steadily, indifferent to Clara's confusion. "I don't know what to do," Clara whispered, brushing her mother's hand. "I'm afraid of choosing wrong again."
Her mother stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open for the first time in days, weak but present. "Clara," she murmured. Tears filled Clara's eyes. "I'm here." Her mother's grip was faint but deliberate. "You've always been strong," she said slowly. "Just don't confuse fear with wisdom." The words settled deep inside her. That night, Clara lay awake in her small room, weighing every possibility. The agreement offered security, something she desperately needed. But more than that, it offered purpose. Sophia. Stability. A chance to belong somewhere again. And Eduardo. She had learned to read his silences, to see the restraint behind his distance. He wasn't asking out of convenience alone. He was asking because he trusted her with the most important thing in his life. By morning, Clara had made her decision. When she arrived at the mansion, Eduardo was waiting in the study. He looked up as she entered, uncertainty flickering briefly across his composed expression.
"I have conditions," Clara said before he could speak. His posture eased slightly. "Name them." "This won't be a transaction without respect," she continued. "Sophia's well-being comes first. And when this ends, we part without harm." Eduardo nodded. "Agreed." Clara took a steady breath. "Then," she said softly, "I'll do it." And as the words left her mouth, fear gave way. Not to certainty, but to something far more dangerous. Hope. The wedding took place quietly, just as Eduardo had planned. No grand hall, no press, no unnecessary witnesses. It was held in a private registry office on a gray morning that felt suspended in time. Clara wore a simple dress, elegant but unremarkable. Eduardo stood beside her in a tailored suit, composed as ever. To anyone watching, they looked like a couple bound by mutual respect, not by circumstance. Sophia held Clara's hand tightly. "Does this mean you're staying?" she whispered. Clara squeezed her fingers. "Yes." The ceremony was brief.
Words spoken without flourish, vows reduced to legal commitments. When they signed the documents, Clara felt the weight of her name changing, not as a loss of identity, but as the beginning of something unfamiliar. At the mansion, nothing appeared different at first, yet everything was. Clara moved into a guest room closer to Sophia's. Eduardo maintained distance, careful not to cross boundaries. Their conversations remained polite, measured, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Not discomfort, but awareness. One evening, as they shared dinner for the first time as husband and wife, silence lingered between them. "You didn't have to do this," Eduardo said quietly. "I know," Clara replied, "but I chose to." Their eyes met briefly, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Later, Clara helped Sophia with her bedtime routine. The child smiled sleepily, content in a way she hadn't been before. "This feels like a family," Sophia said. Clara paused.
emotion tightening her chest. "Families grow," she answered gently. That night, Clara lay awake in her new room, listening to the subtle sounds of the house. She wasn't in love, she wasn't pretending to be, but she felt safe. And sometimes, she realized, safety was the first step towards something far deeper, something that neither she nor Eduardo was yet ready to name, but that had already begun to take root. Life settled into a new rhythm, quiet, steady, unexpectedly warm. Clara's days revolved around Sophia, lessons blending naturally with shared moments, breakfasts filled with small conversations, afternoons in the garden, evenings softened by routine rather than silence. Eduardo watched it all with careful distance, yet distance became harder to maintain. He began noticing the details, the way Clara remembered Sophia's preferences, the patience in her voice, the quiet strength she carried without asking for recognition. Slowly, the mansion felt less like a structure and more like a home. One night, Sophia fell asleep on the couch while reading with Clara. Eduardo approached, intending to carry his daughter to bed, but Clara gently shook her head. "Let her rest," she whispered. "She's been happy today." The word lingered. Eduardo studied his daughter's peaceful face, then looked at Clara. Gratitude surfaced, raw, unfamiliar. "Thank you," he said simply. From that moment, things shifted. Eduardo started joining them for meals more often. He asked Clara's opinion, not out of necessity, but respect. Sometimes their conversation stretched into late evenings, filled with silences that felt comfortable rather than tense. One evening, Clara laughed at something Eduardo said, a soft, surprised sound. He froze for a second, struck by how rare and intimate it felt. And Clara, catching his expression, realized something that made her heart stumble. She was no longer guarding herself so tightly.
Love didn't arrive suddenly. It didn't demand declarations or promises. It grew quietly, in shared responsibility, in mutual care, in the safety of being seen without fear. Neither of them spoke the word, but both felt it. And neither noticed the shadow forming just beyond the fragile peace they had built, waiting patiently to remind them that happiness, once found, is often tested. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly. Clara found an envelope waiting on the kitchen counter one morning, its cream-colored paper standing out against the polished surface. There was no name on it, only a familiar logo, Renato's former company. Inside was a single photograph, Eduardo and Clara leaving the registry office, Sophia between them. The image had been taken from a distance, deliberately, as if someone had been waiting. Clara's hands trembled. That evening, Eduardo received a call he hadn't expected. A woman's voice, smooth and confident, filled the line.
"I hear congratulations are in order," she said. "Your marriage is interesting." Eduardo stiffened. "This conversation is over." "Not quite," the woman replied lightly. "You see, some arrangements have consequences, and I don't like being surprised." The call ended before Eduardo could respond. Across the city, Renato stared at the same photograph on his phone, anger tightening his jaw. The woman beside him smiled coldly. "She thinks she's won," she said. "Let's remind her who she really is." That night, Clara stood by Sophia's door, listening to her steady breathing, unaware of the forces beginning to move around them. The peace they had found was real, but it was fragile. And as Clara turned off the light, she had no way of knowing that the life she was finally learning to trust was about to be tested in ways she never imagined.